Our first speaker for the day is Madhava Jay. He's an artificial intelligence engineer with 18 years of experience with the web and more than a decade worth of experience with mobile apps. He has been working with AI since 2017. He has graduated from university's 6 months artificial intelligence nano degree, fusing computer vision as his final capstone project. Not only this, he has enjoyed several leadership roles throughout his career. He has a very noble aim of giving meaningful contributions to the world in the area of AI and technology. So make sure to interact with him and ask him as many questions as you want. So I'll just give the mic to Madhava now and you can go ahead with this.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure, do I need to minimize this or can you see the Zoom controls over the top? I don't know if they're on the video feed. Oh, great. Perfect. Okay, that's great. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm a little bit nervous. I've given a few talks before, but this is probably the longest one I've done. And so I'm feeling a little bit excited. So let's see, hopefully this goes well. Welcome to my talk, Open Source is Your Destiny, a meme story. That little picture, by the way, fun fact, is of my dog Pickles. He's a Groodle. He's the privacy preserving machine learning pup. Okay, so who am I? My name is Madhava. I live in Brisbane, Australia, and I'm the core team lead at Openmined. If you look at my Slack status, you'll often see, my titles are things like human, MyPy linter. So that's the kind of stuff I get up to. I just wanted to warn everyone that I've done a lot of Googling for this talk. There aren't any references because with like 80 slides, it's just too long to do. This is all my opinion, and so it's not really any official opinions of anyone else. And you should take it all with a grain of salt. And also memes aren't facts, at least not yet. So I got into computers a very long time ago, way before it was cool. Maybe not quite that long ago, but certainly this was my first computer. It's like an XT. So if anyone knows what that is, very early Intel chips and monochrome screens, that kind of stuff. I was 5 years old, and obviously my brother was the one who got it all set up. But he taught me, CD/FP, FPXE, this kind of stuff. And I was just blown away that I memorized these little commands I could type. And what would happen is I'd get to play a game. And I just loved it. I mean, I just love games. I think a lot of people do. And it was my first introduction to computers. And that kept happening. So, funny story, I did try to learn programming at one point, but I just wanted to make games. I just wanted to play games and I wanted to make games. And making games is very hard, actually. But kids don't know that. And so I enrolled in some programming classes, and the teacher just wanted to basically teach me this programming language called Pascal, which no one uses anymore. And he just was trying to teach me about data structures and CSVs and database tables and all this boring stuff. And I was like, I just want to play games. I just want to make games. Come on. And so I quit. So regrettably, I quit a little too early in my programming career at age 8 or something, 10. But I went on to have a fairly successful Counter-Strike LAN kind of history. So that was good times. Probably the first thing that I ever produced, which you could say was kind of like software, was a website for our Quake 3 clan. So I was like really into Quake, love that game so much. And it was really important to me that other people knew that we had a cool clan, and if you want to play us, you could somehow find out from this website. Even though ironically, there's probably no one else had the internet, and this is like dial-up days and stuff. But I learned a lot about HTML. I learned how to FTP stuff. I learned about some basic graphic design and things like that. So I was learning and having fun. And then if you look at my resume, you'll find that the vast majority of what I've done sort of reads something like this, sort of like hand rolling HTML and then pushing pixels and writing PHP sites with database backends, and big long period of my life just dedicated to doing things like IE6 PNG fixes. And there was actually a time where I was doing MySpace page hacks. So someone, I don't know, it was like a band or something, and they basically said they wanted a MySpace page to look really awesome. And so that required a lot of horrible HTML hacking, if anyone ever remembers or even knows what MySpace is. But basically, they offered me like money and a guitar, and I was like, sweet deal. So I took it and tried to learn the guitar, sucked at it and gave up on that very quickly. Went back to making MySpace pages instead. But continued to learn about programming. I got into JavaScript for a bit there, back before it was cool. So I was writing janky JavaScript, making sure that it worked in IE6, which was difficult. Joined a failed startup. I mean, startup wasn't failed when I joined, but went on to fail, which is great lessons, obviously. At some point I won some awards for some iPad something, and I ended up moving to Germany in about 2013 and joined a startup there where we went on to do lots of big data and ad tech, blah. And there was some Android app ouchies, and I joined another company and did lots of Java monolithic meh. And I'm really good at losing hackathons. I don't know about anyone else. And I've joined more failed startups. So but the one thing that all of these things have in common, basically, except for a few exceptions across this entire history, and we're talking nearly 20 years of my life is in that great recycling bin in the sky. And the reason why was because none of it was open source. This is all closed source. Every line of code I worked on, sure, I learned heaps of stuff. And I think, ultimately that's generally the most important thing, but it feels sad to think that there was, no benefit to anyone else in society or the world from all of my mistakes, right? 20 years. Oof. So then, fast forward, this talk is about open source. It's not about closed source. It's not about all the failures of my life. It's about what is it like to be an open source contributor. So this is my GitHub today. It's a little bit more open sourcey and contributy. But, there are other people out there with more impressive timelines. So it's not about that really, but it did start a very long time ago. So in 2012, I guess I must have signed up for GitHub. Can't remember why. And I think the first thing I ever published was this. It was like a Chrome extension, and I was trying to have something that would automatically check a local website here called Gumtree, where people list secondhand phones, because I wanted to buy one cheaply, but they kept getting sniped before I could get them. So I wrote this thing that would give me like a little toaster alert anytime there was like a new phone. Incidentally, I never ended up buying any of those phones, but it was fun. So that was my first thing. Later, I started to actually try to contribute some code. So you have to understand that it really does take a long time, or at least it did for me, to build up from trying to contribute to open source to actually doing it on a daily basis, right? And so here's an example of 2014, or I think, I was working at a startup called YY in Germany, and we had a strong DevOps culture. And I was basically in charge of, at the time, doing some checks for a thing called Sensu, which basically does, it allows you to kind of monitor your hardware and software and make sure that there's metrics and stuff being shipped. There's newer things that people will probably know about these days, like Prometheus and Grafana and stuff. But so anyway, what I needed to do was write a little plugin, because they didn't exist yet, to check these HP RAID drivers to make sure that the RAID hadn't crashed. And it was written in Ruby. I'd never written Ruby before, and it was a little bit of a challenge. But it worked. And one of the guys said to me, "Hey, why don't you open source it? Like, why don't you push it up to Sensu so other people can benefit from that?" And I was like, "Oh, that's really cool. Like, that's awesome." So I created a PR, and basically, you can see here I've just said like, "Hey, so like I've figured out how to do this stuff, and like it works." And the maintainer has obviously responded here and said, "Oh, can you just like rebase the PR?" And yeah, my response was, can you explain what that is? Like, I don't understand, right? So this is the beginning of my journey of online sort of open source contribution. Is first hurdle, maintainer asks you to rebase PR, me, tech. So, like a lot of people, this was my knowledge until recently of Git, where, if there was something wrong, I would just spam random Git commands on it until hoping it would make it work, but often would just make it worse. Everyone's familiar with a good bit of like Git reset hard, and if it doesn't work, just Git push force. Why not? What could go wrong? So it was pretty awful back then, but I learned a lot very quickly about how to interact with these more complex kind of open source branching models that people have online, and how they want to kind of maintain their code. So it wasn't until a little bit later that I actually managed to do something that was, I would say, more kind of complete in terms of contributions. So this one's quite interesting. I was working at a small services company, and one of my workmates, who's a complete genius, was getting really heavily into functional programming and Swift. And at the time, Swift had just come out. So this was, I think, Swift version 2 was when we wrote this library. And if anyone's ever done any iOS development, they probably know of a thing called NS user defaults. And it's just kind of like a key value store where you store everything, right? A dictionary. And it wasn't Swift friendly at the time. So we wrote a library that wrapped around around the Objective-C implementation of NS user defaults and made it nice and Swifty. And we called it Palau. And again, what had happened is my boss at the time, Elmar, he wrote all this code, and he basically said, like, oh, we should open source it. So we did, and I did a lot of research on what makes a good open source project, because I wanted it to be nice and I wanted people to like it and for it to be successful. And so I actually ended up doing a talk, which you can watch, but it's old and super boring. And it basically just explains what makes a good open source GitHub profile. So that people actually use your thing, because you have to understand that when you're shopping around for a library, what you probably do is you Google, you find a few links, look at them, and you're just quickly judging based on how they look. You're like, ooh, I see green builds on parsing. I see compatibility badges. I'm seeing all sorts of stuff in there. I'm seeing a nice logo. I'm seeing a good README with dot points and stuff like that. That's what you want to see when you're trying to pick a library. And often what you'll do is you'll pick that nicest looking one first, and then you'll double check that it has all your requirements. So it's like marketing, right? And I think my experience in web design and all that sort of history of, I did some horrible SEO back in the day, please forgive me. But understanding all that kind of stuff, helped me understand that an open source project on GitHub is also one part marketing, right? It's really important that people can use your stuff and that there's no barrier to entry. So I learned stuff. The thing that often makes a good open source project is an internal tool. If you think about, Kubernetes, right? It's like an internal tool at Google that everyone uses now. Tons of the stuff that we end up using came from an internal tool that people think, well, this worked great for us, so why don't we just put it out there? And that's what it was. It was a simple idea. We had a nice logo. We had a good README. Crucially created CI and tests. And I learned a lot about that, which was super awesome. Back then it was Travis, but now you've got GitHub Actions, which is awesome. And more importantly, we also published to all the package managers, right? So for whatever language and framework and environment you happen to be in, whatever platform, these are the kind of things that you need to make sure that you're ticking all these boxes so that your open source project might actually get some stars. And by the way, I don't think I've any here, but I think we have 500 stars, which is, that's not bad. It was the first time I actually sort of managed to be involved in creating an actual open source repository, and learned about the being a maintainer and responding to issues and all this kind of stuff. So it was super cool. One thing that happened at one point, I was reading these, I was getting heavily into Swift, and I was reading these the Swift evolution proposals. So a lot of languages have these kind of open proposal systems like PEP in Python, where you can kind of basically propose a new idea for the language, and people will vote on it, and if they like it, they'll implement it. Something that I was really excited at the time about was a thing in Swift, where basically the creator, Chris Latner, who had developed LLVM, and while at Apple he had co-developed Swift, he had left to join Google, and had kind of encouraged the TensorFlow team to start using Swift as a possible replacement for things like Python and C++. And they had actually done a lot of work to introduce automatic differentiation into Swift, which is super awesome, but it never got merged into the mainstream of Swift. So by the way, if anyone knows any of those people, awesome work, but please, can we have it? I would love to see Python go away if we could have Swift and automatic differentiation built into the language and stuff. So I don't know. I hear all the cool kids are talking about Julian now because it does that. So we'll see what happens. But I was reading this proposal and I noticed a spelling mistake. And I mean, look, I think good spelling and good grammar is important, and I'm a bit finicky for that kind of stuff. But I did read the whole thing. And I did sort of merge in this PR, basically saying oh, look, you misspelled one word. Later, as a maintainer, I've come to realize that these kind of PRs are not hugely great. Don't get me wrong, the spelling is important and stuff, but if you're, trying to add comments to an open source repo to feel like a contributor, I mean, you're just spraying a hose in the rain. It's yeah. So I think this is one of those things where, don't do that. You learn from mistakes. Everyone kind of sees it as oh, maybe I can get myself into the contribution list on a repo and stuff, but just stop to think is your contribution actually valuable? And maybe you don't know, but just remember to be polite about it. But those kind of things, little nits and stuff aren't always the best thing. So that's something I learned. A few years later, I was doing an artificial intelligence nano degree at Udacity, and while doing it, I was really excited about the idea of basically putting all of my work online so that it could be sort of a CV thing later, and just share with people. And I guess it's a nice workflow. You sort of work on your stuff. I was obsessed with trying to figure out a workflow with notebooks and Python and everything. And I mean, these days it's working quite well, but back then it was very difficult. And it was just interesting because what I found was basically, you know, people were sharing a little bit online, which was helpful because some of these assignments were quite difficult. And, you know, it's not exactly cheating, but if you can look up other people's solutions, it really helps you figure out, like, you know, how do you solve these difficult problems? And I just think it was just like a light bulb moment for me that, you know, all of a sudden I realized that open source isn't just about code. It's also about learning information and lessons and kind of, you know, a way to explore other people's solutions to difficult problems. And since then, I've actually taken an approach sometimes where when I'm trying to solve something, and if you're trying to find someone's way of using an undocumented API, like I was doing a hackathon once that I lost, but I figured out how to use like a undocumented API in Android without root to be able to trigger an incoming call, which I used so that you could answer the phone in speaker mode programmatically, and have a button on your desktop that you could press and it would do it. Right, it's super cool, I thought, but I couldn't figure out how to use these APIs. But when I started trawling through GitHub, looking at the search functionality, I found how other people had used them, and I'd found all these things, and I was like, oh my god, this is amazing! Like this is like a backwards form of documentation from problem to solution. So I think, you know, if you think about it, like open source knowledge, I mean, Wikipedia, that is a lot of the research I did, you know, for this talk is obviously on Wikipedia. I know that teachers traditionally hate Wikipedia because it feels like it's a hack for students, but I think we need to start thinking about the future of learning isn't really about memorizing stuff anymore. It's really about being able to look it up. It's being able to how to sort of like learn how to use it, how to work with it. And in a sense, open source knowledge is really all about, you know, how you can utilize other people's hard work in a way that is optimal and effective without having to reinvent the wheel. So another project that I ended up successfully contributing to back in my early OS days was basically this thing called label image. So I was getting into AI, and there's this thing, I don't know if anyone's used it before, but it's just like an open source labeling tool for labeling images for sort of object detection or classification. And I couldn't get it working on my Mac, you know, and this was a great example where I realized, like, you know, I'll probably be able to do this. Like, I really want to do this because I really need to get this thing running on my Mac so I can label all these images so I can, you know, train this AI model. But also, once I figure out how to get it working, you know, why don't I share that? Because it's not working. And it seems like the developers don't care because they're all, you know, Linux Ubuntu users. And so, or maybe they just can't test it. It's not so much about not caring. It's sometimes these things are quite difficult. But basically, you know, I was like, well, why don't I contribute that? And it got merged, you know, and I was like, wow, that's awesome. So like really actually, you know, appreciated what I did. And I learned, you know, with this one, it's like, my problem was I couldn't get it working. But it's also really important that if you want to get people to merge in your PRs, that like not only is it useful, but you test it thoroughly, you document it thoroughly. And I went a step further and actually did a thing that you could sort of describe as adding delight, you know, sort of contributing in a way that is like unexpected. And I created a new icon. So I went and sourced like a PNG that looked really cool, and then put the copyright contribution correctly in there for licensing purposes. And it meant that when you ran this one-liner that I did for label image in macOS, it would install it and you could have a little icon in your little DOM. And I was like, super awesome. So later on, you know, about 2020, as everyone would remember, this awful thing happened called COVID, and I'm pretty glad it's all done, right? It's all gone, isn't it? It's all finished. No. Anyway, well, so COVID started, awful times. I did lose my job at the time. I think the startup I was in missed a funding round, and it happens. And you know, I just remember jumping out of bed one morning and thinking, like, my God, you know, this problem, and like software, we can surely help somehow. Like, you know, come on, like classic Silicon Valley attitude. The world's problems could be solved with software. But anyway, I was super interested in what I could do personally to help. I mean, I'm not a medical person. I'm not a firefighter, you know, so my, like, the cape I wear is just like, you know, spreadsheet kind of clothing. So the only way I could think of to do anything meaningful was through software. And I was watching this presentation from someone called Tina White from Stanford, and she had started this like group of people who basically were saying, well, what if we could use like Bluetooth and we could do this contact tracing thing and blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure everyone in the world has probably A, heard about this, B, installed one of these apps and felt possibly concerned about their privacy being invaded, and C, it's just, yeah. So I'm not here to sell you on the outcome of it. Suffice to say that, I was involved for a little while in an open source project, and it was interesting because what I learned was, time zones really suck. Like for years, I had been working remotely as a digital nomad from about sort of 2017 through to about 2020 almost. And I was used to working across time zones, but often with only one other time zone, or being in the same time zone and moving around a little bit and that kind of stuff. All of a sudden, I was working with teams in Europe and America, East Coast and West Coast, and then some people in the sort of JPAC region, India, of course. And man, like time zones really suck. Like I think all programmers know that time zones are annoying, even when you're just coding about time zones, trying to figure out, like conversion between time zones and using time zone libraries and all that stuff. But when you actually have to work in them with other people, it's very difficult. And so, one thing I learned was you have to be very sort of like conscious of whether or not you're blocking other people through time zones. And things that would happen would be like, I would wake up and then I would have to have like a sync with someone and try and figure out like, what did you do all day while I was asleep and how can I help contribute now? And so there's this constant like need to do in-person synchronization. And I'm, to be honest, not sure still what the optimal way of doing this is. But as COVID has sort of shown us, like remote's not going away. And I think the future really is global first and remote first. But basically, we need to figure out how to handle time zones better because it's extremely difficult. Another thing that we struggled with in this crazy open source, decentralized anarchist project that we were running was like rebeating code, right? So when I joined, there was like a code base for like the iOS app and Android app. And then I think people were talking about some kind of backend, but I'm not really sure. And then I offered like, hey, we could quickly set up something with Firebase. It'd be really quick. And then we can have like a database. And there was all this concern about like tracking, all these problems and everything. And I was like, sure. But like, we still need something that works, right? And so anyway, in the end, we built sort of like a TypeScript application, and it worked. And we used like the Firebase APIs. We had, this sort of serverless architecture and all this stuff. And then, at one point, this guy from Google came and joined of his own volition, not officially as part of Google. And he was like, oh, we should rewrite it in Go. And I was like, I mean, no one in the team is like telling someone from Google like what to do. We're like, okay, yeah, like we're all ears. Like, please let us learn from your amazingness. And so, sure enough, I learned some Go, which is interesting language. And we rewrote all these services in Go. We added this super cool crypto stuff that he knew about and everything. Only for that to then find out that Google was officially building a sort of project in the COVID exposure, not just the notification APIs, but like a server that would manage all these keys and do all this stuff securely. And to be fair, like I think if you're going to trust your population, your citizens, your own kind of privacy, on one hand, it's very hard to give that to a big company and say, yeah, sure, we trust you. But on the other hand, giving it to a bunch of anonymous open source contributors is also questionable, because like, how do you know that they're doing it right? Like, it's very, very difficult political situation that we're in. Suffice to say, the code got rebooted again and again. And all that happens really when that happens is you just churn really, really, really hard. So people were coming and going left, right, and center, particularly when you rewrite the code base, you've just got people just disappearing like that. And I think that was an interesting lesson to learn about open source and whether or not you keep your code stable, how you introduce big refactors, whether or not it's smart to reboot code bases and throw away people's code, because ultimately you don't want everything to end up to being that kind of big, great recycling bin in the sky. It hurts emotionally. On one hand, you've invested time, and people talk about I talk about the concept of burnout, and I think I saw a burnout definition one time, and it was basically that burnout is caused by contributing to something which in the end doesn't matter. You know what I mean? So basically, if you work on something for ages and then it gets thrown away, like, what's the point? Why did you even do it in the first place? So that was interesting. We had a great vision. I think people really wanted to help. I don't know if the outcomes in the end were really that helpful. I Googled it recently and it looks like maybe some thousands of lives were saved or something. I'm not really sure. If that's true, that's cool. I like that, but it's questionable, right? Like who knows what the outcome of all that was. I know in Australia, the app we use is not based on anything like that. And I've never heard of anyone say that anyone ever got contact traced through a contact tracing app here. So I'm not sure that it was necessarily good. And later down the track, we're going to find out whether or not that kind of technology was a good or a bad idea. So it's certainly interesting. In terms of impact, I got this awesome mug, and I was using it today. So that's great. I contributed in open source for a few months and got a mug. But hey, I learned heaps of stuff and it was open source. So it didn't really go into the great recycling bin in the sky as much as previous work. So maybe that's a good thing. There is stuff out there that people can learn from that we did. And I personally did not contribute in the cryptographic sense, but the people on our teams who did deeply influenced what Google and Apple ended up doing for their sort of exposure notification APIs. And so I think maybe assuming that all was done correctly and in terms of people's privacy, it was probably a good thing. So interestingly, that led me through to my kind of current role at Openmined. I was getting interested in the privacy side of things. So one thing that had happened was in a previous startup, I was dealing with medical data and AI, and one of my concerns was like, how do we protect people's privacy? So there's this like very real things like HIPAA, which basically say that if you leak people's data, you can basically go to jail. Like it's pretty serious stuff, and it doesn't really happen very often. But like you don't want to be that guy. You don't want to be the CTO. You don't want to be like the next Theranos or whatever, because you just like thought it was okay to have customer data unencrypted, or you screwed up your encryption, or you just didn't have the right level of security. There's just so many security threats. Like if one thing you can learn is that if all the big companies get hacked, then like what good have you got as a small startup or like an individual to have like perfect security? So I was super interested by this idea of security, and I remember I had already joined the Slack channel months earlier before the pandemic. And then Andrew had sort of asked like, hey, like, does anyone want to help with any of this contact tracing stuff? So that's how I got into COVID Watch. But then that had fizzled down a little bit. And the team lead at the time, Ben, he had asked me like, asked around, does anyone know iOS? Does anyone know Swift? We want to do a differential privacy port for various different platforms. So Google had produced this C++ library that was able to add noise to statistical calculations that allowed a thing called differential privacy, which is like an output privacy technology. And I was like, yeah, cool, sounds awesome. I've got like experience with that, and I want to learn about this kind of like privacy enhancing technology stuff. So I did this. It never really got used because it was quite difficult working with the Bazel build chain. I have to admit, but I learned a lot. And in the end, when I'd sort of finished this, and I did at one point, one of our DP experts, Critica, had written a example of how to do differential privacy in TypeScript actually, and I ported it to Swift, and it was nice. It was just like some Laplacian noise and stuff like that. But I said to Ben, like, hey, like we can't just keep rewriting like all these DP algorithms in like 10 different languages. That's not going to work. So we need some kind of like we need some kind of like lingua franca. We should write this all in one language. And so we had sort of done a little bit of playing around with Rust, which was really cool. But that's definitely another story. And I guess, to sort of explain a bit more about what Openmined does, we've got this great meme. So, we have zero knowledge proof, homomorphic encryption, federated learning, private set intersection, secure multi-party compute, differential privacy, all the cool keywords. There's actually a really good video. Well, this is the meme that one of our homomorphic encryption guys, Bogdan, did, which I think is pretty funny. Of course, I can't hear anyone, but I'm just assuming everyone's laughing because I am. So that's privacy that's what data is to privacy to Openmined, basically. But if you want to know more about it, I would highly recommend checking out this video from Andrew. And there's obviously heaps more resources online if you Google like Openmined and Sift, which is the sort of product that I'm working on at the moment. But that chat's really, really awesome explanation on what's going on. And so somehow I eventually came to become what you could call a sort of code janitor. And that's how I got involved in this project as it is today. And if you look back at my first PRs, you know, they're very humble and sort of, you know, code cleaning kind of stuff. So this first one is like fixing tests. And I can tell you right now, if you want to get involved in an open source project, if you're willing to go in there and fix tests, if you're willing to, you know, maybe fix an issue where the version of Python wasn't being supported that was older, or you know, adding pre-commit, or doing a lot of MyPy typing. You know, this kind of linting tasks, the cleanup stuff that no one wants to do, refactoring and tests. Honestly, like that is a really good way not only to learn about the code base, but to show that you're competent and interested and to get involved. And if you want to do that at our repo, I can tell you right now, I've got, you know, positions for people right now if they want to do this kind of stuff, because no one wants to do it. It's the hard works that needs to be done. And, you know, like this is what's the secret to a good team and to any kind of open source project or any kind of, you know, real software, is good testing and, you know, good linting and that kind of stuff. So this is how I sort of began. I think my wife kind of thinks that this is like what I do. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm somehow like Matt Damon from Good Will Hunting, just like the janitor, you know, just like spots the equation, like solves all the problems. You know, like great. Like it's very hard to explain sometimes what you do to other people in your life. But I think this is more really who I am. I'm more like Charlie from Always Sunny in Philadelphia. So yeah, so I'm nervous, and I think laughing's a good time right now for me to sort of have a little laugh at myself. But yeah, so yeah. Basically, if you do enough Charlie work, you end up here, you know, like, so you can see my commit graph. I've really sort of done a lot of commits, and it's put me near the top. Don't be deceived by number of lines modified though. Often that can be exploded out from doing a lot of linting and things like that. But certainly I've contributed a lot to this project, and you know, I really, really thoroughly enjoy working on it. But the humble beginnings, you know, it's not really about coming in and just like writing some amazing algorithm or whatever. It's often just about like doing the hard work that no one wants to do. So problem is that once you become a maintainer, everything's a little different, right? You're not just a contributor anymore. You're kind of like, you get this horrible inbox that you ignore every day. Like if people don't like, you know, having full email inboxes, imagine having like, you know, your full GitHub inbox. And oh man, it's a little bit, it can be a little bit stressful, you know. So you have to, I think, change your attitude towards it and realize that, you know, focus is everything. There's always going to be people with issues. There's always going to be people who want answers, but you have to really focus on what you're working on, because if you don't build the thing that you're working on, then everybody loses. So that's quite hard, striking that balance. And you know, I'm still learning. It's my first time, I would say. You know, we have like 7,000 stars on GitHub, and you know, we have like many years of contributions and hundreds of contributors, and it's the biggest thing I've ever been part of in public and open source, and I'm still learning. And you know, yeah, it's interesting. So as a maintainer, you know, one of the things you do, right, is you're just constantly trawling through the PRs. So now suddenly you're on the other side of the fence, right? You're the one who's looking at people who are submitting PRs, going like, oh, fix the spelling mistake, or like, you know, stuff like that. And you're like, okay, cool, yeah, I get it. You know, everyone starts at a different position, and everyone has a different idea about what, you know, they want to contribute to a project. It is open, but it doesn't mean that, you know, everyone else gets to decide the sort of the future of it. You end up with these things where often in programming, you know, you sort of need your BDFLs, you know, your benevolent dictators for life. You need people who can make decisions, because a democracy or like a committee is not always going to get everything agreed to on time. So in this case, you know, you sometimes have to make decisions on what gets, you know, what gets merged. And ultimately, I'll tell you what, you know, they call me the MyPy human MyPy linter, because, you know, I'm not merging that PR if it doesn't, you know, pass all the linting checks. I'm just telling you right now. So a deeper question I think you could ask is like, do maintainers dream of continuously integrated sheet? I mean, for me, it's like, you know, green fields. I just want to see those green ticks. I know that the health of the code is good, because when it goes bad, when you accidentally have like code merged in and it's broken, you know, you can lose productivity. The whole team doesn't know what they're doing. I can't even, if I'm trying to fix something, how do I know I haven't broken it worse if the tests aren't running anymore? So you just lose full confidence. It's this really difficult problem. And it's like crucial, I think, in open source, that you have like these very rigid and reliable structures, and it's very important for contributors. They need to know how they can make sure that their code is going to get merged and that they haven't broken anything, and that the linting is done correctly, and what the style guide is, and all this kind of stuff. So this is kind of how you want it to be. Lots of green ticks. So what's the difference between like working in open source and like working sort of closed source? I mean, you have to kind of be careful about what you write. Like, I'm pretty sure I may have accidentally committed some very mild swearing before in my print statements, and maybe I should just not do that. But like, it's just natural, it's like really late at night and you're just trying to solve a problem and you're telling the computer to F off, and then you accidentally commit that. So try not to do that. Detecting emotion in text chat's quite difficult. So basically, it's important that that you kind of like have some compassion with the people you're communicating with, because unlike the pre-COVID world where we had face-to-face offices and stuff, and this is a lot to do with remote first, I guess, in many ways. It's very hard to know whether someone, what they're trying to say, and you should just assume the best in people, always anyway. But you have to be very reliable, because when you're working throughout time zones, people depend on the work that you do when they wake up. So their whole day can be totally stuffed if you left CI broken or you didn't fix the thing that you promised you would. And everyone's at different stages. It's really important to understand that, everyone's coming to this. Like, you could be me from 7 years ago, where you basically don't know how to rebase and you're just like typing random commands hoping it's going to work. Like, have compassion for those people and show them how to do it properly. So make sure that you ask questions if you're a contributor, and if you're a maintainer or another contributor, just help out and just assume everyone is a noob like me. Also, remember, often contributors are often unpaid, so there's only so much you can assume from them. So what's good about open source? Like, enough about my great recycle bin in the sky. There's so many other things about it, operating systems, right? Everyone knows Linux. Linux created Linux, and it runs everywhere, and it's awesome. There's also FreeBSD. There's a kernel inside of like Mac OS. It's based on this whole thing, and but everyone would know Android. You could say it's kind of like it's basically like a Linux kernel, and it's basically an open source operating system. There's a few closed source bits, but you can almost entirely run a phone entirely on on open source, and that is really cool. And then you have things like FreeDOS. If you wanted to play that game that I mentioned at the start of this chat, you could do it in FreeDOS. And Microsoft are not supporting DOS anymore. I mean, hell, they're probably not even supporting Microsoft Windows XP anymore. So there are people out there who believe in kind of maintaining this like history of all of our culture and our archiving all this important human art that we created as things like games and stuff. And so having open source implementations of things that we can continue to keep these things running and alive and supported is super important. If we talk about browsers, Firefox was the original. I mean, come on, that's what took down IE. It was awesome. And then Google quickly came along with Chromium, which is in everything. Apple helped with WebKit as well, which became Blink kind of. And now even Microsoft uses Blink in their Internet Explorer Edge Chrome clone. So they won. They won that fight. And now when you look at iOS, Android, desktop, everywhere you go, all these browsers, they're all basically sort of some kind of version of Chrome/Blink. And that's good, because if you have ever done CSS or HTML, you know that this is what it's like, particularly back in the day when like you had IE6. The bad thing about closed source was you couldn't see what the bugs were. You'd have to like test the software, probing it, attacking it to try and figure out why it didn't work. That's where the term quirks came from. And that was awful. I mean, think about how many lives were wasted just trying to solve IE6 bugs, which immediately, all of this evaporated once we went open source, rapid updates, and improved, browser ecosystems. Web frameworks, WordPress, React, Django, Symfony, like, chances are, if you're on this call, you probably have interacted with these many different ways, either working with them, viewing them, writing them. The reality is, like, we should not be reinventing ORMs and CRUDs and login systems just so we can publish text and images to the web. And that's good. That's great for society. And, honestly, like, that's all pretty much open source. Getting stuff done is really important. This guy, Levels.io, he's awesome. He's on Twitter. Follow him. He created all these awesome remote, digital nomad resources, but he's sort of well known for being open source business. Like, he publishes what he does. He publishes his income stats. He talks openly about everything he does, and he makes good money, and he codes in PHP, and he doesn't care that other people don't like that. And I think he's awesome. And this just shows us, like, there are new economic models, and they're based on open source and open business and open attitudes online and remote and global and digital first and all the buzzwords. Containerization is super important. Operating systems are becoming a thing of the past, which is great. And be able to take your application, run it anywhere, it's super important. It seems like we've finally settled with the Open Container Initiative on, Docker and Kubernetes working together and splitting the difference there on what needs to work. And it's just lovely. Like, we use it in our dev stack every day, and it's amazing that we can have something that just runs on Linux and Windows and Mac and all these different systems and in the cloud, and we don't have to really think about the nightmare of managing all these different infrastructures. And that is now basically all open source. And to point out something here, JVM, if you think about it, it's a Java virtual machine. It was very proprietary and closed source. And people got around that in the end, but like, you can see how that was the end of the old way of doing things, which was proprietary and licensed. And it's not really, who's talking about JVM anymore? Oh my God. I have a special spot in my my heart for gaming. Shareware is kind of not really open source, but it was like encouraging people to share software and pay for it later, maybe, and things like that. But probably the best example of that would be like Quake, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Wine, I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but basically you can run Windows games on Linux and on Mac as well, and it's super awesome. I love this meme over here of Keanu, like, what if Windows is just really a really good wine emulator and you're actually running Linux? I love that idea, because like, maybe that's basically it. I mean, who knows what a Windows 11 is going to be like, but it could just basically be eventually Linux with a nice GUI. And in many ways, Mac OS is sort of built on this same kind of like Unix kind of kernel. So Steam OS, they're pushing Wine, they're kind of converging gaming. If anyone has noticed, all the consoles have converged on x86, which is good. And I think maybe if you think about it, consoles will probably converge on some kind of Linux-based kernel, probably, which is good. And it's going to be mostly fairly open source. Maybe they might keep some stuff to themselves, but it's more and more becoming apparent that it's not helpful to do that. And when it comes to video graphics, what about Vulkan? That's an open standard now, and I think that could really change the portability of games between systems, which would be awesome. So Quake, special place in my heart. John Carmack, he open sourced it. I mean, like, so there's hundreds of resources out there of different ports, different mods, all this stuff. Like, the early modding community with gaming all really started with Quake. And he open sourced it. He's open sourced many of his engines. If you think about it, there are probably thousands, if not more, game developers and engineers out there who learnt by looking at the source code of Quake, by seeing, what the master John Carmack, big fan, by the way, was able to kind of code up, and then just gave it for free and said, like, learn from all of my hard work and take this. Like, at one point, there was a whole business model around renting out, was sort of, licensing out the game engine so people could make 3D games. But by making it open source, you're saying, like, go nuts. Like, you can literally make a free game tomorrow, and people did, and I think that's beautiful. A great example now how this thing still has not died is someone just released Quake 1, first few levels, in 13 kilobytes of JavaScript. 13 kilobytes of JavaScript. You can't even get this picture for 13K probably. That's just insane, and it works and it's super fun. Go check it out. But this is just like is never going to die as like a kind of a meme that if you want to port to a new system or a new platform or a new constraint, try running Quake on it. Like, I wonder, I don't know, does anyone know if I think they joked about putting Doom or Quake on one of the Teslas, launching it out into space. So incidentally, if you have had anything to do with gaming, if you've ever bought a GPU, you've pretty much contributed to AI, because everyone knows AI is currently just all based on GPUs. So I think that's like a nice way to kind of realize, like, gaming has been really instrumental to AI, but also to kind of like open source as well. And this is like really interesting. So if we think about, like, what are the programming languages that everyone uses? Well, if we look at the TIOBE index of the top 10, let's think about which ones are open, right? C, open standard. Python, open source. Java, okay, OpenJDK, I'm giving it like a cross, not a tick, but ultimately it's basically now become open because it has to. You can pay Oracle, but many people don't, and that's good. C++, open compilers like GNU and Clang. C# is now open, and they have a compiler called Roslyn, and it's able to compile VB code, apparently. I don't know, because I'm sort of not in the VB game. So, also really bringing Microsoft forward into the open source future. JavaScript, open standard ECMA. V8, open JavaScript engine. I don't know why assembly is listed on this top 10 list here. It's a bit weird, but I guess you could say, like, CPU instruction sets aren't really open, but there are some, like RISC-V. Check it out. It's awesome. Chris Latner left Apple and Google to go join a Sci5 RISC-V company. So I bet he's going to do something amazing there. PHP is open. SQL, it's an open standard, or it's an ISO standard. It's not even open. But there's a lot of free OS engines. Everyone knows Postgres and MySQL, so that's good, but it's like, it's not quite. Some notable other things, all the new languages, they're either from a big tech company or they're basically open, all right? Swift, Go, TypeScript, Rust, all open, all on GitHub, more importantly, and Julia, which, is a foundation of its own, I guess. And a really cool thing that Rust has is it has a thing called MD Books, which is a way to turn Markdown into ebooks that you can install on your Kindle or whatever. And that's awesome because it means that all of the documentation in the Rust world is like good books that are written by people that you can read on your thing for free. And to me, that's like another whole angle of open source, a bit like Wikipedia, that people haven't really been thinking about, which is like open books and open documentation in a format that's like actually quite usable. So, source control, it used to actually be lots of different things. There was Mercurial and SDN and BitKeeper. But apparently what happened was BitKeeper, which the Linux project was using, they started to want money from Linux. And Linus was like, no, I'm just going to make my own. So he actually named Git after himself. He says, I'm an egotistical bastard and I named all my projects after myself. So first was Linux was named after Linus, and now Git, which is like this British word for like being, like an idiot or a bastard or something. So it's kind of funny. So, but everyone uses it. GitHub, Git everything, it's Git now. There's no one's doing SVN. Oh my God. So here's a quote that doesn't age well. Steve Ballmer, he said that Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. Developers. I mean, look, that was ridiculous, but he got one thing right, and that is developers. It's all about developers, open source and developers. And the times are changing. I mean, this legend, everyone I'm sure here knows who he is. What have we got now? We've got Windows has Linux built into it, and it's good, by the way. I think that means kind of hilarious. But basically, it's really changed my approach, because when I'm having to support Windows, all I think about is WSL. It's one line to install. And if you can do it, then I can just deal with Linux and I don't have to remember about Windows anymore. So where is open source number one? All right, servers, mobile, Internet of Things, browsers, web frameworks, languages, source control, containerization, cross-platform desktop apps, data science, deep learning, developers. You could argue that it's really one in so many places, right? So open source really is the key. Data is the new oil. Out of these top 10 companies, 8 of them basically do software. Some do a little bit of hardware. There's one oil company and one investment firm. So we know that data and software are this kind of new economic paradigm, but it's not evenly distributed, right? So big database licenses are very expensive. Software licenses are expensive. Students can't learn enterprise software. Governments have tremendous IT costs. And the developing world is disproportionately affected by this, right? So it doesn't even have to be the developing world. I used to live in Munich in Germany, and for years they've been trying to build their own version called Linux of Linux that would replace their subscriptions with Microsoft. Keeps going backwards and forwards, but apparently recently they got a green government coalition, and they're going to reinvest in doing this again. If they were to release a operating system that was government friendly, other governments could use that and they could save a lot of money and also contribute, right? So, stonks. Sorry. Basically, there are economic models that open source completely changes. So who's currently paying for everything right now? We've got ads, Google, Mozilla, Facebook, databases, Oracle, IBM, Microsoft, a lot of SaaS stuff out there, a lot of cloud services, but ultimately, the only alternative revenue streams we have are donationware, crowdsourcing, bug bounties, delayed open sourcing and copyleft. By the way, this is a cool project. Check it out. It's basically running Linux on Apple, and I'm one of the Patreons for it because I think it's such a great idea. So the guy, Markan, who's working on this, he's purely being funded by people who just want to see this happen. I think that's a new world that never used to exist. Quick shout out to a thing called Open Collective. Openmined is part of Open Collective. That's how we take donations and we pay some of our staff. So check it out. It's super interesting. I just want to add this little quote here. We are the product, we're not the customer. It's one thing to kind of suggest more individual control of data and privacy, but if that happens to a sufficient degree, it will upend the entire economic model that has supported the internet to date. This is from Lex Friedman's AI podcast, and it's about privacy, data, that kind of stuff. And what it's saying is that, like, if we can figure out how to use people's data without violating their privacy, we'll have whole new economic models, right? So at Openmined, we like to say that all your data belong to you, and open source is better than secret source. Right. So Gallup estimates that the US economy loses like $50 to $150 billion a year due to failed IT projects. Open source often means we don't have to keep reinventing the same wheels. Like, what about the carbon footprint? Has anyone asked like how much we're ruining the environment by everyone just like making a new to-do list app? You know, and then there's the question about the right to repair. Like, surely that kind of applies to software as well. If you could fix your own bugs, you know, do you have the right to do that? Can you audit the security of the software that you're running? Is there algorithmic fairness in the software that you're running? You know, what about these new economic models? And just remember also, like, life is a team sport. We should really be collaborating more than competing. So another funny thing is that memes are probably open source, right? You take a meme, you modify it, you publish it. It's hilarious. Biology. Where am I going with this? This is a great talk. Go check it out. It compares some of the things in computing to some of the things in DNA and biology. And there's a lot of parallels. Super interesting. But fortunately, human genes can't be patented yet, and that's great. But what is life, right? The condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, including the capacity for growth, reproduction, functional activity, and continual change preceding death. Well, it's a lot of argument about it, but we know, for example, that viruses aren't quite life, or they're probably not, but computers have viruses, which is interesting. And I think, you know, we're kind of like working towards this thing where what if software could reproduce itself? More than a virus. Like, a virus can't really write itself. It just copies itself from one computer to the next, right? But what if it could actually write code? And if anyone has seen OpenAI Codex, which, by the way, is trained on all the data from GitHub and probably other stuff from the internet. So again, if you're contributing open source and you're not going into the big recycling bin in the sky, you're going into the singularity, right? Your work is becoming part of this future AI that's able to recreate and write itself. So, you know, what is the purpose? Well, if you asked Encino Man or a Cro-Magnon man, like, what is his destiny? He'd probably say to you, he doesn't know. So you could ask the same question of ourselves. You know, what is our destiny? What is our purpose? Well, we don't know, but it's probably to evolve into something like a singularity, maybe. So there's this cool thing called the GitHub Arctic Code Vault. I'm in it. A lot of people are. And it's basically this idea that, you know, we're going to start kind of taking all of this open source code that everyone's creating and really archiving it and making it into something greater than, you know, for the future, allowing people to be able to permanently learn from this on the record. It's going into the fossil record, right? It's crazy. We're going to be like a little troglodyte. Someone will say, oh yeah, cool. You know, like, we can see thousands of years ago, this guy Madhava did this really crappy, you know, PR to something. Like, probably not, but, you know, that's hilarious. So, you know, I'd like to sort of finish by saying that, you know, open source, like, it's your destiny, whether you like it or not, right? There's a high chance that you're going to work in a large tech org or, you know, something like that who creates open source code. There's a high chance you'll write code using public platforms like GitHub. You have a high chance that new economic models will replace copyright, at least for software. So many businesses these days are built on open source and they have open source code. They just make their money other ways. And, you know, you can build anything today with open source. You can run businesses. You can help change the world. So if you're not already doing it, I would say don't fight it. Come join us. So just quick shout out. If you want to join Openmined, we've got a Slack, openmind.slack.com. Check out the GitHub, you know, github.com/openmind, and there's a Twitter feed as well. If you want to get started on contributing, let me know and point you in the right direction. Love to take some questions. You can scan that QR code just like you're probably used to now from COVID everywhere to get a quick copy of these slides if you're interested. They're a little bit out of sync because I was rushing to finish this quickly, but I'll update it later, but it's basically this. And I'm just going to assume everyone's clapping right now because I can't hear anything, and like it'd make me feel nice to imagine that that's actually what's happening. So yeah, thank you and happy Software Freedom Day. Questions?
Yeah, that was an amazing presentation. Madhava. We were laughing all out. So yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah. So any questions, guys? Someone is saying, glad to know what you are master in the art of means a lot. Okay, so some of the questions are in the chat. You can look it up. It's quite long.
How do I do that? Sorry, can you just read them? I'm just trying to figure out my Zoom.
Okay. Since you have till now contributed a lot, I wanted to ask, what is the ideal way to write commit messages? The standard differs from repo to repo, but what according to you is ideal? And how to take care of different features /table/release branches? I have seen open source repos going nuts on branch management.
Okay, it's a very long question. So for the next questions, we'll keep them a little shorter so I can remember the whole thing. But you asked about commit messages. It's a good question. I would say, I Googled this a while back and found, or I was reading an article a while back, and it really pointed out something really interesting, which is that if you leave a space after the first line and then write everything after that, that's a really good idea because of the way it like truncates. And it does depend on the platform, but everyone's using GitHub these days anyway. One thing I would say is make sure you keep the line width to like 80 characters or whatever, a bit like when you're doing code editing, because otherwise you get the ellipses effect. So I like to have basically like this sort of thing, like what I've generally done is the first line, and then next line, nothing, next line. And then I do sort of like dash dot points with like a kind of like, I did this and I did this and I did this. Everyone has their own style. But I think do a bit of Googling and see what other people suggest, but there are some mechanics to what you publish as to how it appears. And that's helpful when you're diffing and you're trying to like find commits and stuff like that. So yeah. Also, bonus thing that most people don't know is you can put co-author, look it up, and it means you can tag someone else in your commit and they get actual credit for it. That's great for peer programming. And it's also great if you're rewriting someone's commit and you had to fix it, but they didn't get credit. Really always make sure you give other people credit where credit's due. It goes a long way. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, so I have a question. Like, when you started out in open source, like, what was your thought process? Like, how should I go forward? Like, you must have like set up some goals, like you have to achieve in the future. So those small milestones, what were they?
So some goals on achieving in the future, did you say?
Yeah, some milestone you must have set up, like everyone does, I think.
Oh, so like what's my overarching goal, you think, is the question? Or yeah. Look, I mean, in my bio it definitely does say that I want to do, good things for the world and stuff, whatever. But yeah, look, I still very deeply interested in learning about AI, but like I'm also busy just like doing like janitor work. So I guess, I still feel like Matt Damon, right? But like early on in his career before he learned any of the math. So I don't know, like, no, I like to be the dumbest person in the room, because if you're the dumbest person in the room, then you're learning from all these smart people. If you're the smartest person in the room, go find another room, because like, you've got learning to do. And so, yeah, I'm happy wherever I am learning. And right now I'm learning just heaps of stuff. So my goal, I guess, is just to keep a pulse on that thing. I would say if anyone's heard of the flow, right? The idea is that you have like a two-dimensional graph between difficulty and interest. And so on the bottom half, you've got boredom because it's like not difficult enough and you're sort of bored. And on the top half, you've got like anxiety, you're stressed because it's like really hard and you don't know how to do it, right? And people are like, hey, where's the code? Have you done it yet? So in the middle is like flow. Things are challenging enough, but you can do them. You need to find your flow, and you'll be happy, and you'll be much better at contributing as well. You'll be, more valuable.
So I've got a question from Meghna. Starting out in open source, what kind of repos should a new programmer go for to learn and contribute?
What was the question?
Repos.
What kind of
repository?
What kind of repos would?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't.
What kind of repos should a new programmer go for to learn and contribute?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. I probably should have been more clear about that, but I think the reality is you need to work on things that you like, that you care about, and that you understand a little bit about, just a little bit. Just find the thing that you can contribute. So if you notice, all my early PRs were things where I did something and it kind of worked for me. I fixed a problem that I was having. So I think, this goes back to the classic question people say, like when you're learning programming, like what should you work on? I mean, preferably not another to-do app, but like build something that you need, that you want, that interests you. You should be focused on things that aren't just programming for programming's sake. And then the passion will come because you're like, man, I really just want to solve this problem. I really did actually want to get into gaming, and I was gonna get into gaming, but I kind of think like that was probably good that I didn't, because I hear that game developers just, oh man, it sounds like a very hard job. So, but find the passion, and the passion will drive it. So looking for open source repositories that that are things you work on. Like just literally, if you're using a browser, or if you're using an operating system, or if you're using, so start with your skill set. Like maybe if you're doing like a lot of web-based stuff, go looking for a framework that you work with and go find an issue and fix it. So I think that's a good way to start.
Next question would be like, you are working as a core team member at Openmined. So you must have a team working under you. So how do you keep up their morale? Because open source is a thing, like sometimes your PRs get merged, sometimes they don't, sometimes all the work you have done must go into dump, but still you have to keep up their morale. So how do you work with that?
This is a really good question, which I, don't think I've figured out the perfect answer to, but it's like, that's a soft skill that you learn over time with managing teams and being a nice human, which I hope I am, but I'm not perfect. And I guess it's like, you have to remember that, like, if you're gonna deny someone's code or you're gonna modify it or something, you should talk to them about it and you should be like fair about it. And I actually go a little step further. Maybe that's the janitor in me. But I kind of feel like if you're going to be nitpicky, which, it's very hard because someone can be like nit, and you have to not take it personally, but you should have a conversation like, hey, look, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings, but these things need to be fixed. I kind of have this other thing in me, which maybe isn't good advice. I don't know, but it's what I do, where if I see some of these things, I just fix them myself, right? And I push. And the great thing is if you're a maintainer, you can just push that and people can see what you did. They can follow by example rather than being told all the time. There's a couple of reasons why I think that's important in the future that we live in, which is this remote first time zone problem. If I block a PR with a bunch of nits that I could fix myself in a few seconds, I'm just putting everything off by a day and slowing everyone down. Yeah. What I could do is just fix them and explain next time, could you do that? So I don't know, it depends really on what it is. And you shouldn't do that all the time, but I think it's important that, like, it's a team effort, right? You should just be thinking like, how can I mentor or help this person? So, but how do you keep their morale up? Is like a deeper question, right? People, I don't know, I think they really like compliments and they really like, free stuff and just like generally being told that, they're appreciated. And that's really important. Like, so I use a lot of emojis. I think text doesn't convey enough emotion. So it's really important to like be as alive as possible, chuck some memes in there, because, we're all just like staring at blank walls and typing, and like, it's important that we feel like we're actually humans, especially in today's like COVID-y, remote-y world where sometimes you're just not sure whether, like, are you even working or are you just having some weird dream where you're in the Matrix and like, you just, yeah, it's really hard to tell. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. Okay. So another question I have is, what is your working experience with Openmined?
What's my working experience with Openmined? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like, as I said in the talk, my first thing was really just like to basically port this library to Swift, right? And it was I guess it's really hard with open source because imagine this, right? Like in the old world where you join a regular company, you submit a CV and then people look at it and then they maybe interview, or if it's like FANG or something, they're going to force you to do some whiteboarding. But like, ultimately they're going to have to give you some money and you're going to do some work, and they really, depending on the laws of the country, they may have a really hard time firing you if they don't like you or if you don't fit. So it's like, it's risky, and it's just like, should we give this person money to do some work? In open source, like, this is literally, you've never met this person. They might not even be real. They could be like a scammer. Like, how do you know? So like, I just feel like giving money over the internet to people is a totally different feeling. I mean, I'm not the one doing it, but I can totally understand that the bar is different. And so I can understand that when I joined, a lot of what I did was unpaid, and it was just, and I did it because I really wanted to. I really wanted to contribute and learn. I had no intention of making money. That wasn't the goal. And I think that's really important that people understand that. Open source doesn't mean free. It doesn't mean unpaid. It can be paid, and it can be, people are running full successful businesses and stuff. But I think, if you really get into the spirit of it, it's about what you're working on, and then focus on that later. So then what happened was, just organically, I got invited to join a different team because I was contributing and they wanted to utilize my skills elsewhere. So I never asked for it, but it happened. And I think, that's a nice way to go about things. I didn't go looking for open source. It went looking for me. It was my destiny.
Okay, that's an amazing answer. Okay, so another question I have is how to take care of branches. I have seen many open source projects merging feature branches directly to master. Meanwhile, some projects have a staging branch, and they make sure that master is always stable. What, according to you, is the ideal method?
Yeah, it's like really important. So there's a few things out there on different ways to manage like branch sort of merge policies and things like that. But I'll tell you two things that I think are really important. So one is when people start using your library, like, stability is really important. And we've made some mistakes there for sure. And I'm sorry for that, but it's like, we've had to move fast and break things or whatever. But, we do try to maintain a main branch where we just don't really merge into there. And like, unless we're absolutely sure, we use dev as like, the sort of primary branch that's being worked on. If you go to the page, it's dev. And that's just because we're dev focused. We're pre #1 release. So like, we're still very alpha beta. But it's really important that we see dev as stable. So that's why I was talking about CI. It's really important that dev is stable enough that other people can develop on it, right? It's really important. I think the one thing I've learned is that you really do want to have short-lived, continuous integration and merging, because the longer these PRs live, the harder they are to merge. The more chance you just go LG looks good to me, LGTM, which is not good, and you end up little subtle bugs and things get hidden in there. And what could be, it could be like 4 o'clock in the morning, like this literally happened to me the other day with Andrew, where we're trying to find a bug and we're bisecting 60 commits, and we're binary searching by hand through them, looking for the one that worked. There's something you shouldn't be doing, and that's you've stuffed up because you've allowed dev to become broken, and then you can't trust any of the commits. So don't do that. And the other thing I would say that's kind of important is I mean, you're supporting these branches, right? So it's important that people know that they can rely on them. But don't. That also goes for the other people who are doing PRs. So when you do a branch, like you're branched off, say dev, right, and you're working on it, and it might live for a while, a few weeks or something. You go to merge it in. Whatever you do, I've made this mistake. It's 2 or 3 times now, and I regret it every time by accident. I love rebasing when I've got a branch and I want to update it to the head of whatever's there. But I've accidentally rebased a big merge into dev. And what it's done is it's rewritten all of the history. What immediately happens is that sorry, I just need to plug my phone to charge. Immediately what happens is that the other people's PRs don't work anymore, because like all the commits don't match anymore. And then they're just like, oh my God, what do I do? And it's like a nightmare. So don't do that. Make sure that you preserve history at all times. Otherwise you're going to stuff up other people's commits. And then personally, I'm the one to come along with the mop and fix it. And I'll just cherry pick and fix. But yeah.
Okay.
Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I can just hearing it. I think it's like a very tedious task to me.
Yeah, it's unpleasant when you have to do it.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts about GitHub Actions? Do you think that it is popular just because it comes with GitHub? Do you think it's powerful enough with the likes of Travis and Jenkins?
GitHub Actions is awesome. Back in the day, it didn't exist, and I used things like Travis, and they were really good, and love Travis. So, but like, you can't beat free, like, and it's built in, and it's really, I love the whole YAML format. It's like, it's really good. Eventually, you may find, so like the free credits, the way it works is you can kind of have like unlimited free Linux, but there's a cap on Windows and Mac, particularly Mac, because they're just expensive to have to run the machines in the cloud. And we're sort of hitting the stage at one point where we were doing huge amounts of batteries, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different tests running, not like individual tests, but actual like runners. So we were testing. You kind of get into the multiplicative problem of like every version of Python and every version of Torch and every version of whatever operating system, and you end up sometimes with like hundreds of these. Just double checking. So you run out of credits pretty quickly. You're not paying for them, but it just means it limits how many could run in parallel. So then all of a sudden CI is blocked, and somebody else is trying to fix their bug, and they're waiting like half an hour to find it. You don't want slow CI times. So inevitably what will end up happening is you'll be pushed to running your own CI runners. Fortunately, it's not too difficult now. You can run like a GitHub runner instance as a Docker container on some of your own infrastructure in the cloud. But you might need advanced use cases like GPUs. You can't currently get them on GitHub, and things like ARM processors or the new M1 chip. There's always going to be something that you probably can't run there, and you might need to run your own CI pipeline to get that working. So I think GitHub is amazing. Start with GitHub CI. And then, go from there if you need anything more. But it's like, it's really for most people, all you need. And I think everyone should learn about it because it's basically a de facto now. Like, look, I love GitLab. They probably the first to do free CI and free private repositories before GitHub got bought by Microsoft. So they had money to just do that. And so I temporarily was using, GitLab for everything. One of the startups I was in, we used GitLab because it was free. It's awesome. And I love it. And they're all remote first. The guys are awesome. They're legends. But like, I'm sorry, like GitHub is just really good. And now it's free. I have to kind of hang out there. But like if GitLab, if you want to do anything, like they've got some other really cool stuff, like some CI pipelines. One thing they have is you can run the whole CI pipeline on your local machine exactly as it would be in the cloud, and it works great. GitHub added that recently. I think someone's created a tool for it, but it's a bit buggy. So the hardest part about GitHub Actions and all CI is when you have to do things that are out of the normal, situation, and it's usually other operating systems, Mac or Windows. So yeah, one good thing is having a distributed team with different environments, so you can do some very real world dog fooding to try out what all these different environments are like, and you'll find bugs faster. But yeah, testing is everything. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, so the next question is, like, looking at your journey till now, how many technologies have you learned, and do you forget some of them, and do you also Google them?
Definitely. Come on, everyone. So
Yeah.
I think, one of the things I wanted to point out in this talk was that, why should we have to reinvent the wheel? When I was in high school, we had to always remember all these formulas in math. And I get that. You need to know them so you can apply them really fast. You kind of need them in your cache, so you don't get a cache miss when you're trying to do a calculation. You don't want to be Googling Pythagoras' theorem every time you want to use it. But it is important that you understand that there's a trade-off between remembering everything and just being able to look it up again and then utilize it. They're not the same thing. And I think the days of not being able to look stuff up is just stupid. Come on, let's move on beyond that. Everybody Googles everything all the time.
So
the only ramification of that is you need to be careful about what the truth is. But honestly, I love reading these stories of how Stack Overflow answers that are wrong make it into production code that then breaks everything. Beautiful. But be careful. Yeah, I do it. Everyone does it. Just one of the best things you can do is when you copy code, rewrite it yourself. So, rename the variables and refactor it and kind of massage it a bit as you go, because that's how you'll find the issue. That's how you'll understand it better. But hey, come on, copy and paste is probably the single greatest invention of all time, and it creates bugs for sure. But without it, come on, we'd never get anything done.
so it's safe to say that you are a person that can say that Googling is a key skill that can
be a skill set. It's actually a skill set. Honestly, a lot of the time when I find answers to problems, it's because I have not given up on Google. I've literally said to myself, I know the answer's out there. I just haven't found it yet. You should actually believe that it's already been done before and disprove yourself by looking harder and harder and harder. And eventually you'll probably find it. And if not, then great idea, create it. But there was two parts to that question, right? The other part was what have you learned heaps of technologies? Yeah, I mean, look, over the years, I've learned heaps of different technologies, but I think when you're younger, it's all about this programming language, and then if I learn a second one, oh my God, and do it, learn a second one, because you'll learn so much, learn a third one, learn a fourth one, but eventually you'll learn that it's not about our language. It's just, it that sort of transcends all that. And you're really just sort of focused on, what's the right thing for the right tool for the job, because there are so many tools wrong for the job, right? So yeah, I don't know if that answered it, but
yeah, okay. I heard, I read an article where someone had written Googling in their CV and they have sent it to the company. So the recruiters were like, can we list it as key skill? And that became used.
I think the problem with that is it's nearly impossible to prove. How do you validate that? It does sound a little bit silly. No one's writing Microsoft Word on their CVs anymore. They probably shouldn't. But these are kind of just assumed skills, I guess, to some degree, but not everyone has them. And yeah, it's a soft skill. But I don't know how you prove it to anyone. I think it's, to me, I just assume that anyone who's really good at figuring out problem solving is really good at research, because chances are you don't invent the answers. You're not the, Goodwill Hunting. You're just the janitor, right? That's me anyway. As spotted, there was already solved. I just noticed.
Okay. So the last question for the day, what was your source for the amazing memes?
What was the source for all these memes?
Yeah.
Google. I just Googled. You know what I loved? I had so much fun making this, even though I did it probably a little too late. I'm just one of those people who, does the homework at the last minute kind of thing. But basically, every time I had an idea, I Googled it and the word meme, and I just scanned looking for the one that made me laugh. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what I was thinking. And so what I love about memes is, Richard Dawkins coined the term many years ago. It's DNA, gene meme. And the idea is it's it has memory, it's passed down, right? And so if you've got a thought, there's a chance that someone else has had the same thought and they've turned it into a meme. And that's what I love about memes, right? It's just what my inspiration is really just communication. I'm just I have an idea and I want to get it across. So if I type in those keywords and there's a meme that explains how I really feel, it's someone else has already, and the internet and other people have already kind of worked together to survival of the fittest, pick the best gene meme that describes my feeling, and that's why it makes you laugh, because it's actually it's evolved literally to be optimal at describing the thing that I wanted to describe.
Yeah, there's one more question. Like, AI technology is usually based on Python these days. If you were to find an alternative for it, what would you go for?
Yeah, I mentioned this in my chat. I'm really devastated that Swift hasn't really taken that position yet. So Chris Lattner created LLVM, he created Swift, he encouraged Swift at Google. So the TensorFlow team had a sort of alpha that I tried to compile once on my laptop, and it nearly died. I think it was like 30 gig of RAM was being consumed. And anyway, so it turns out you can't just compile LLVM and TensorFlow very easily. But basically, I think, Swift would have been really great, but like from people like Jeremy Howard, sort of saying that it's not going to happen. He was having conversations with people like Chris Lattner about this. And because he's disappeared to work on RISC chips, I don't know what's happening. Doesn't seem like there's anyone at Google and Apple who want to talk together about getting that code mainstreamed, which is sad. So who knows? But, Julia, I haven't checked it out. People say it's good. Python just keeps getting better in a way that's annoying, because it's like good enough. And you know what we've really been getting into, which I really think is like probably the best thing to do right now. Like, it's not the best thing in 10 years. It's not the best thing in 5 years. But right now, if you're writing code, what I think you should do is write Rust and write a Python wrapper for Rust using this thing called Pythonium trioxide, and it's such a nice experience. I did an experimental branch for SIFT with some of the other team members of this, and it works, and it's glorious because you get beautiful Rust, and it's fast, and it's cross-platform, and then you can wrap it in Python if you want, and that's also trivial, and then you get that high-performance Python that you want. So APIs in Python, code in Rust, only because I can't code C++ and I have no intention of learning it, so I'm not going to advise that you do either. But if you already know, kick ass.
So thank you, Madhav, for joining us today. And it was an amazing talk. We laughed a lot. And yeah, so also I appreciate the work you are doing with Openmined. I heard a lot about you from Andrew, and yeah, it has been a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was my pleasure. And yeah, look, I look forward to the next one that I do, and the memes will keep rolling. So have a good laugh, and please share the chat if anyone thinks that they enjoyed it. And I'll